Welcome back to Broadway Breakdown, where I take my nervous energy and channel it into being a nerd about theater on the internet. Yes, I am sitting on my bedroom floor, I am drinking wine, deal with it. If you don't know me, hi, hello, I write books under the name Gemma Tate, I have 2 history degrees, and I love musicals, especially Les Mis. And lately, I've been seeing a lot of discourse that makes me really uncomfortable, because I hear a lot of people talking about the song, Do You Hear the People Sing, as the song of our times, the anthem of our days, when the closer anthem, and arguably the point of the show, is probably Empty Chairs at Empty Tables, maybe Bring Him Home, I can explain that one in a minute. And today we are going to get into the history of why I think that's the case. Also, when I talked about this in a shorter video a while back, some people said that I was being pretentious and that I needed to leave my ivory tower. Y'all, I went to grad school for history, on purpose, at a school older than the United States, and I am sitting here talking about musicals, Broadway musicals. Of course I'm pretentious. I have never claimed to be anything otherwise. If you're still here, let's talk about Les Mis. First, a little bit of background. We have to note that Les Miserables was not set during the French Revolution. That's a popular misconception. It was set during the June Rebellion in 1832. So let's set the scene. The French Revolution, 40 years earlier, 1789, was a success in the sense that people got more power than the monarchy originally allowed them, but the people did not successfully overturn or get rid of the monarchy. The people in general, the Third Estate, were not necessarily thrilled with that outcome. So in July of 1830, we get something called the July Revolution, which led to the overthrow of King Charles X, and he was the French Bourbon monarch, and that led to the ascent of his cousin Louis Philippe, who was the Duke of Orleans. The thing is, under the post-1789 government, France had been a constitutional monarchy with the restored House of Bourbon on the throne, not too dissimilar to the structure that Britain is kind of still operating under. But the 1830 revolution, the July Rebellion, swapped out the system for the July monarchy, which took power away from the House of Bourbon, handed it to the House of Orleans, making it a much loosier-goosier system based around popular sovereignty rather than hereditary government. But keep in mind, all of this hinges around France having a deep class divide, a parliament that is slowly losing power in favor of a monarchy that is still spending way too much money, and an aging aristocracy that is aware of what's happening, but doesn't have any real motivation to change what's happening because the wealthy are still benefiting under the July monarchy way more than they were during the Revolution, which is a time that they still remember pretty acutely. And in the middle of all of this, Paris is undergoing a modernization project, which is mostly done but not completely, involving complex sewer systems, huge factories, and active ports. So by the time we hit 1832, France as a whole has just been through some massive upheavals. The conservative law and order government that followed Robespierre's reign of terror directly following the revolution in the 1790s left people really terrified, kind of like super traumatized, of further radical change. And the politics throughout the country, but especially in Paris, are changing really drastically from one month to the next. Some workers, but mostly the younger aristocracy who weren't alive for the 1789 revolution or the Reign of Terror, but they've been alive through the early 19th century and they feel like they know what's going on, they decide that they don't like the system that they're in very much. They don't know what they want to replace it with, but they know that they no longer want a monarchy. They are anti-monarchists. So we fast forward to June 1st, 1832. And a guy named Jean-Maximilien Lamarck, he's a popular former army commander, he's become a member of the French Parliament, and he is critical of the monarchy, that's important. He dies. So Lamarck, Victor Hugo, who wrote the book version of Les Mis, he's described as loved by the people because he accepted the chances the future offered, and was loved by the mob because he served the emperor well. At his funeral, a group of wealthy students broke into the funeral, interrupted the eulogy with the announcement that they were going to start a riot, and then they spread a call throughout Paris for workers and the lower classes to join them in their uprising. If you know and like the show, this might sound familiar to you. The line from the show is, Lamarck is dead. Lamarck, his death is the hour of fate. The people's man, his death is the sign we await. The thing is, the workers, for the most part, didn't join the students. The line in the show goes, students, workers, everyone. Yeah, in reality, it was pretty much just the students and a handful of workers, because the students didn't understand that they were fighting against the system that they were in, sure, but without a great sense of what to bring in to replace it with. Nobody had a reason to join them because the people of Paris at this point had suffered a great deal under a bunch of systems that weren't all that well thought through. So the students were anti-monarchist, but they weren't explicitly pro anything else. And this is probably the more difficult aspect for them. They didn't have enough societal awareness, or at least enough awareness of Parisian power dynamics, to reach out to the street gangs. And they didn't have enough power to successfully recruit older and wealthier members of the aristocracy or the military. There's also an argument to be made that they just didn't see the value of incorporating older folks, and so they just didn't do it. And then add into it that most of these students didn't have actual military service experience, and those that did chose to leave it early so that they could go to school. So a lot of those students don't survive that one night on the barricades. Empty chairs and empty tables, or even just the one line from the show, "You on the barricades, listen to this," that's a really good summary of how that went. The students built barricades. The students built barricades in the narrow streets around Rue Saint-Martin and Rue Saint-Denis, which would have been smart. Objectively, that would have been a good idea, except that both of those streets had alleyways that weren't being watched, and the students, because there weren't enough of them, didn't have enough manpower to hold those barricades in the first place. They don't even make it a week. On the morning of June 6th, the last rebels were surrounded at the intersection of Rue Saint-Martin and, I believe, Saint Mary. At that point, Louis-Philippe, the king, decided to show himself in the streets to confirm that, he was still in charge. His National Guard had done their job. So he returned to Paris from St. Cloud, where he'd been hiding, and he meets his ministers and his generals at the Tuileries, right at the center of power, and he declares a state of siege, and then he rides right through the area of the rising on his horse to the applause of the troops, and at that point it's pretty much a wash. So how does Victor Hugo and Les Miserables fit into all of this? For one, we should all remember that Hugo was there for the June Rebellion, although he didn't write Les Mis for several years after. He actually got locked in an alley between barricaded streets for, he writes about it like it took about an hour, and he spent that time huddled in a corner with his books over his head as bullets flew past. He sympathized with the revolutionaries fairly vocally, especially as he got older, but he was a pretty harsh critic of their processes and their lack of forethought. So, looking back on it, what was Hugo trying to say about the rebellion? A surface read of the book, and certainly the play, implies that the rebellion was all in vain, and that Hugo's main takeaway was that one line, "Nothing changes, nothing ever will." But it's more complicated than that. For one, we should remember that the 1830s led into the many revolutions of 1848, and the lasting repercussions of the June Rebellion could be said to contribute to the larger story of national and political struggle in 19th century France and really around Europe. In other words, it's one thread in a much larger tapestry of revolution and counter-revolution and societal change. You can kind of think of it like Rogue One in the context of the greater Star Wars canon. No, they didn't win, but their failure was part of what future rebellions were able to do later on. In this context, we're talking about 1848. It's what makes 1848 doable. So Hugo is very concerned with showing exactly how bloody the failure was, just how bad it got. And he makes a point of noting all of the various places where the students totally failed because they were more worried about having a revolution than they were about that revolution having real impact on the people around them. Hugo talks a lot about the trauma that a failed revolution causes and about what it's like to be part of a generation that tried to change things and failed. It's pretty easy to read that Hugo feels a really huge sense of survivor's guilt at the time that he's writing Les Mis. As much as he glorifies the idea of a revolution, he also puts out a pretty sincere caution about how difficult it really is to enact real change. We see it pretty clearly in the section of the book that directly correlates to empty chairs and empty tables. And it's especially clear in the chapters towards the end of the novel, where even as everybody's putting their lives back together, Hugo's spending pages on pages just describing the heaps of bodies in the roads and the blood that turns the sewers red days after the conflict ended. So with that in mind, let's talk about what Hugo romanticized versus what we as the audience in the 21st century romanticize. Hugo was very, very concerned with Catholicism. And sort of a step beyond that, the brotherhood of man. He talks a lot about good works and good deeds for the possibility of redemption and heavenly ascension. And the relationships that he emphasizes the most through the book. In no particular order, we've got Eponine as the direct counterpoint to Cosette, as well as the counterpoint to the Thénardiers, including Gavroche, who in the novel is Eponine's little brother. Valjean and God as a counterpoint to Javert and his relationship with God. And then you get Marius and Courfeyrac, who I actually think are one of the more interesting relationships in the book. Courfeyrac is another one of the revolutionaries, he's another one of the students. I'm pretty sure they were secretly dating for the whole book, but whatever. And then Enjolras and Grantaire, who the musical handles really well with Drink With Me as paired with Red and Black, if you're really looking to get into that kind of thing. But the dichotomies that the book presents all revolve around faith and redemption rather than love or freedom, which is different than how the musical presents it in some ways. The book is pretty aggressively Catholicism versus Calvinism in some ways, but more than anything, it's about the possibility of redemption and just how much sacrifice is required to be redeemed. But then we consider that the musical, especially modern interpretations of it, seem to emphasize the relationship between freedom and control. And they really focus, modern productions of it anyway, really focus on love being the transformative thing that shapes youth, while commitment to promises or ideals is what shapes the more mature characters in the play. So the big aspects of romanticization in the play are, to some degree, the students, sure, but it's their relationships to revolution and to the working class via Gavroche more than it is about their commitment to one another or to the outside forces around them. The musical, I think, does its best to excise just how much the students are wealthy kids, and it frames them more as men. In the book, Marius still lives with his wealthy conservative grandfather. He's fully playing by high society's rules up until he moves in with Courfeyrac. And it's only at that point that he realizes he's going to have some kind of class consciousness. He doesn't have Enjolras whispering in his ear telling him that he needs to make a choice until it's much, much later. And there's absolutely a world in which the point of the book and the musical is best conveyed through the song Bring Him Home, or even What Have I Done? Because those are the songs that revolve around redemption. They revolve around the choice to have faith when all hope is lost. And that's the kind of theme that Hugo really leans into across most of his work. And it's something that the musical really takes and runs with. If you look at how the musical handles the juxtaposition of Valjean and Javert, that's what it's all about. And I do think that you can also interpret the story as one about mercy. Javert's absolute refusal to show it to Valjean at first, the bishop's insistence on granting it to Valjean, and finally Valjean's choice to pay it forward as far as Fantine, Cosette, and finally Marius are all concerned. And in the end, it's that humanity that Valjean has learned how to have that ultimately breaks Javert. I do think it's important to note that Javert's not that bad, and part of the point of the show and the book is the empathy that a reader or viewer develops for him. Because this is the thing about Javert. He's a rigid structuralist, yes. He's a monarchist, yes. And that reads downright evil in our current, modern, deserved, ACAB social justice atmosphere. But remember, Javert would have inherited the jailer position. That was usually something that was passed down through families. We even get a line about it in the show, I was born inside a jail in Confrontation. And he would have seen the absolute horror and chaos of the Reign of Terror as a very young man. And it's also plausible that that's when Valjean was imprisoned in the first place, which really throws the loaf of bread into perspective when we consider what food prices, particularly bread, were like at the time, and the fact that bread in particular was considered a luxury item in plenty of impoverished places. And this is the other thing. Javert is only obsessed with Valjean when he's in a position to be reminded of his failure to his prior commitments, to his previous moral code. In other words, whenever Valjean shows up and rubs his existence in his face, knowingly or not. The rest of the time, Javert's not sitting there gnashing his teeth chasing Valjean around. This isn't Catch Me If You Can. Javert spends most of the timeline of the show doing his normal rising up through the ranks police stuff. You know, he's crushing revolts, he's being all buddy-buddy with the National Guard. Even during the 5 days of the June Rebellion, Javert doesn't care that much about where Valjean is, even though he now knows exactly where he is. He spends that time infiltrating the barricade and trying to cut those rebels down to size. Then Valjean shows up again and completely destroys Javert's sense of self like a huge jerk. You know, by showing mercy and upending Javert's idea that criminals deserve all the shit that he's done to put them down and keep them there. And the idea that horrible criminal Valjean has been the greater man all along by showing mercy, by living closer to the word of God as Javert understands it in reality than Javert has managed to do his whole life with all of his noble principles. And that is the absolute breaking point for a character like Javert, who has spent his whole life bound by a very strict moral code. Javert is also saving Valjean one last time. As much as it's a horrible thing to see him do to himself, it's also a very clear sign that from that moment on, Valjean and Cosette are safe. And it's Javert who has guaranteed them that safety by ensuring that he keeps his mouth shut forever. It's an act of cowardice as far as his own ability to grapple with his actions goes, but in a really twisted way, it's also sort of one last act of mercy towards Valjean and everybody else that he's oppressed over the years. We're sort of set up to not like Javert no matter what, because we are meant to see things from Valjean's perspective. And we are meant to back the revolutionaries who Javert has set himself up to betray. But ultimately what plays out is that we see a man who is deeply flawed and whose story is quite tragic, but he's ultimately not really the bad guy either. Okay, so a small note on casting, because I love live theater and I will never shut up about how I think that the actor who plays a role changes an existing story in really cool ways. I do want to mention that my favorite Valjean is the original, but not because he originated the role, it's because he lived in it for so long. Colm Wilkinson started playing Valjean in the original cast. He kept playing the role for 10 plus years. He went from the West End to Broadway and back. He was Valjean in the 10th anniversary concert, and then it's really cute. He shows up as the bishop in the 25th anniversary cast recording. And it's so cool to watch him grow into the role, first playing a role that's significantly older than his own age in reality, and then aging into the role, being the same age as Valjean is supposed to be, and then younger than his actual age. And it's especially fun because you see Valjean age over the course of the play, so you get to see the space where Wilkinson is actively inhabiting the role more and more. And it's really clear that from one production to the next, he as an actor was understanding and picking apart different things about the character, and it's so interesting to see just how differently he plays it, not just depending on the production and his age in it, but depending on who's opposite him as Javert, my favorite of the bunch being Philip Quast, because of how different stage chemistry can alter that dynamic between actors and therefore between characters. I also really love that Wilkinson goes deeper and rougher vocally rather than resting on that really clear high tone that most of the others on the West End and Broadway lean into. I will also note that my favorite Marius is Chris McCarroll for a very similar reason, actually. He plays Marius so young and exuberant and joyful and open, and then he brings in this physicality in Empty Chairs and Empty Tables, and he's angry and he's hunched over, and he looks 10 years older than he did 2 scenes earlier, and it's stunning. And it makes me want him as Orpheus in Hadestown, like yesterday. Similarly, my favorite Eponine is Lea Salonga, specifically because of how well she sells Eponine's emotional arc over the course of the show. It's a difficult role vocally, absolutely. But the hardest part of that role, I've always seen as keeping Eponine from being the one-dimensional flat character that the musical really tries to make her. And on that note, Erica Henningsen gets bonus points for me for being basically the same age at the time she played Fantine as Fantine actually was at that point in the book. Erica Henningsen was 23 when she played Fantine, which makes her the youngest actor to ever play the role on Broadway. And you'd think that that would take away from the role, or at least from the depth in her ability to portray it, because Fantine is almost always aged up for the play, because Cosette has to be older to, like, avoid breaking child labor laws and to keep it from being weird that she's dating full-grown man Marius. But by making Fantine really young, you can see the youth that's just been totally overridden by the abuse and the pain that Fantine has been through by, not even halfway through the play. And I think it really adds a great deal. You can see just how raw and real that desperation is. It makes her reappearance in the finale song on stage at the same time as adult Cosette, with both of them looking like they could be the same age, feel so much lighter and more peaceful. So what do we take away from this story? Listen, if you want to stand outside a courthouse and sing "Look Down" or "Do You Hear the People Sing," that is your choice. But my day job is professional activism, and I can promise you that a general strike without the mutual protections guaranteed by a union, or standing outside with an ensemble and singing, are choices that are not likely to enact real change. Ultimately, art is art, and you can take any message from it that you want, even if your takeaway is something that I wholeheartedly disagree with. To me, the takeaway is a little bit "gather ye rosebuds while ye may," a little bit "rebellions are built on hope," and a lot of it "learn from our mistakes," learn from how bad revolution can be while you're in the process of trying to enact it. We can't guarantee how a given rebellion is going to work out, if it's going to work out in our favor at all, or even if we're going to survive the political tumult of our own times. What we can do is commit to living fully. We can commit to falling in love carelessly, and most importantly, to creating art that depicts the ups and downs of what we're living through. And we can learn from the history of what's come before us. And yes, we can always choose to turn our lives around and make better choices, though, let's be real, I'm not nearly Catholic enough to talk about that the way that Victor Hugo does. Anyway, that's about it for my Les Mis Broadway breakdown. If I missed something, or if there's another show that you would really like me to talk about in depth, please bring it up in the comments and I will see what I can do. That's it for now. I will catch you in the next one.